The Vauxhall Cavalier, along with the smaller Chevette, signalled the end of British Vauxhall design and the ascendancy of a series of well put together cars from Opel's design studio. But UK customers didn't really mind. In fact, they approved, with Vauxhall going from the purveyors of rust buckets that very nearly got shut down completely to the #2 car brand in the 1980s. It's an amazing turnaround, and a large part of it can be attributed to the Vauxhall Cavalier. So how did this happen? What did Vauxhall and Opel do to make the much loved Vauxhall Cavalier the 6th highest selling UK car of all time? This is the Vauxhall Cavalier story. The story starts with the release of the Ford Capri in 1968. GM's German subsidiary Opel had got wind of the new car and started production of a competitor. This would result in the 1970 Opel Manta, but at the same time Opel realised they could use the Manta's chassis as a basis for a new saloon car that they originally intended to replace the Kadett, but it eventually became a new car that would fit between the Kadett and the larger Record. General Motors and Ford were old rivals in North America, and GM wanted to best its old rival in Europe. The Manta would take on the Ford Capri, and the Ascona would take on Ford's mighty Cortina. Unlike the Cortina, it would be available as a 2- or 4-door saloon plus an estate. It was even exported back to the United States as the Opel 1900 until exchange rate woes and emissions rules led GM to import the Japanese Isuzu Gemini, itself based on the Opel Kadett. Over in Britain, Vauxhall's star was on the wane with a series of poor financial results. In short, they weren't selling enough cars. In the 50s and 60s, their cars had been dogged by rust issues. Even though Vauxhall had got on top of these issues, customers had long memories, and the Vauxhall Viva and larger Victor weren't making much of a dent on Cortina sales. Ford had started rationalising its European car design teams. All cars from the 1967 Ford Escort onwards would be pan-European cars, and it was natural that General Motors would want to do the same to save costs. With Opel's German workers producing solidly built cars that people actually bought, it put Vauxhall's team at a disadvantage. What Vauxhall needed was a big hit, preferably something to take on the dominant Ford Cortina, of course. Their initial plans had been to take the Vauxhall Victor platform, shorten it, and to use it as a new, larger Vauxhall Viva. The company went as far as a 4-door saloon mock-up known in 1971 as the Serion. It had a modern look that had no front grille. Work continued into late 1971, refining the shape, where the 4-door turned into a 5-door with the inclusion of a hatchback. It also gained stylish flush-mounted door handles. By 1972, the team moved onto a full-size mock-up that included an interior design. In addition, the team created a sporty 3-door to augment the range. By the end of 1972, the car was taking shape, and all that was left was for management to agree to put it into production. At the same time, another team within Vauxhall was working on a competing design. Again, it used a larger chassis and was intended to be a new, larger Vauxhall Viva. But this was more conservatively styled, providing elements from the existing Viva. With the increasing fashion for hatchbacks, this would be both a 2- and 4-door saloon and a 3- and 5-door hatchback. But with Vauxhall cars selling like stale cakes, the company was losing money hand over fist, and the hammer fell on both projects. GM even considered shutting down all car development, design and production, especially after Britain's entry into the common market in 1973 made importing cars from the European mainland cheaper. However, after much deliberation, the decision was taken to keep manufacturing cars in the UK, but with a significantly reduced design team. Vauxhall would sell rebadged cars designed by GM and Opel. But the problem remained of a Cortina competitor. This problem also dogged Opel in Germany, where Ford had started selling the Cortina as the Ford Taunus. Opel were working to extend their Ascona from being only a little larger than the Escort to be a true Cortina competitor. With the Ascona selling well, it was decided to introduce the updated model to British shores as well. Maybe to justify their existence, what's left of Vauxhall's development team felt it needed some changes for the British market. Although the Mark II Ascona had updated suspension, Vauxhall made a few more changes. The Ascona styling would be updated with larger front lights and a smaller front grille, similar to the next Cortina update, but Vauxhall's American design chief Wayne Cherry wanted something more exciting. He worked on Vauxhall's aborted Serion. He'd been responsible for the transatlantic Vauxhall Firenze styling, as well as the Vauxhall styling research vehicle concept that owed less to the Vauxhall Victor and more to a Saturn V rocket. By 1973, he'd produced a comprehensive rework of the Ascona's exterior to give the car a familiar Vauxhall look. A new interior was also investigated, but was ultimately rejected in favour of Opel's design. By the summer, the car had a tentative name, the Magnum, maybe to not so subtly imply its larger size. It also got a launch date, 1977. Like the Serion, the car would be both a saloon and a hatchback. In 1974, General Motors brought in a new man to run Vauxhall, Bob Price. He'd been highly successful running General Motors in South Africa, doggedly harrying his workers to improve quality, and it had borne fruit. He was keen to do the same with Vauxhall, but more importantly, he wanted to turn it into a successful, profitable enterprise that would persuade General Motors to keep the lights on. The Magnum would use Vauxhall's engines and gearboxes, but after a cost review, the decision was made to go with Opel parts. The styling team also reworked the Magnum design to make it closer to the upcoming Opel Manta design. This would allow the new car to use Opel bumpers and other parts, so reducing not just the cost to make the new car, but the time it would take to bring it to market. At this point, work on the new car just ground to a halt for some reason, and the Magnum name would be pilfered for use on an enlarged Vauxhall Viva. Vauxhall's finances, thanks to the oil crisis, were headed south again. It would take until April 1975 until plans for the new car would solidify, and it was a daring plan. In just 6 months' time, Vauxhall would release the new car. It would be heavily based on the Ascona, but would use the Opel Manta front end. Underbody rust prevention would be included, as it would be on all other Vauxhalls, to ensure rust wouldn't come back to haunt the Vauxhall name. The new car, now named the British-sounding Cavalier, maybe to hide its Germanic origin, would only be available as a 2- or 4-door saloon, just like the Ascona, with a 2-door coupe that was essentially the updated Opel Manta. Trim levels would match the Cortina, as would the price. Vauxhall wasn't playing around here. Big compromises had to be made to get Vauxhall fighting with Ford, not in 1977, but now. One major hurdle in this plan was production. To meet this goal, the car would need to be produced in the Ascona factory in Belgium. This was not going to sit well with trade unions, who would see this as the beginning of the end for British Vauxhall production. They would have to be assured that production at British factories would begin as soon as possible, but it would involve delicate negotiations. Amazingly, Vauxhall pulled this daring plan off, and the new Vauxhall Cavalier would launch at the London Motor Show in October 1975 to great reviews. The fresh sporty look struck a chord and made the 5-year-old Cortina look suddenly dated. The suspension changes were spot on and were a standout feature. Using the Ascona for the new car had been a masterstroke. Vauxhall had been able to deliver a fresh-looking new car on a shoestring budget, and the increased output would allow Opel to repay the development budget much faster. Back when Opel and Vauxhall produced different cars, Opel dealers in the UK distributed them. It seems Vauxhall hadn't informed them of the Cavalier's launch, as they had to immediately discount the Opel Ascona and even provide customers refunds. Egg was definitely on face. With near identical cars sold at Vauxhall and Opel dealers, not just in the UK but also in many European countries, GM spent the late 1970s consolidating dealers into one larger Vauxhall-Opel network. With strong demand for the Cavalier and the end of the unloved Vauxhall Victor, production would soon begin in Luton. And with production started in Britain, the smaller Vauxhall 1.3 litre engine was added to the existing Opel 1.6 litre and 1.9 litre engines. Soon it was the best-selling Vauxhall in Britain. But with the new larger Cortina released in 1976 and Vauxhall not having a competitive fleet lineup, the Cortina remained far ahead in terms of sales. Back in 1971, Vauxhall had been working on the exciting sport hatch version of the Serion that showed there was still life in Vauxhall's design department yet, and a Targa version was even considered. Despite the constantly scaled back plans for the new car, Wayne Cherry's hatchback concept had never really gone away. The 1972 mock-up would have turned heads if it had been released, and was still around in a slightly watered down form in 1974. But despite all the turmoil, work continued at Opel's design studio, possibly because Ford's 1974 Capri 2 was a hatchback and the Opel Manta wasn't. Work on the hatchback three-door Ascona and Cavalier continued and became the first joint release of a Vauxhall Opel car in September 1978 as the Sport Hatch. Reviewers said it was better than the Capri, although they felt it was a little down on power. Vauxhall also offered a short-lived open top that same year, with the conversion work done by an outside coach builder. With Vauxhall's recent penchant for car names starting with the letter C, this was known as the Centaur. This expanded the ever-growing Cavalier lineup, but one shape that was missing was the estate version, something the Cortina range had offered for years. This, along with Bedford van and pickup versions, was investigated, but with these shapes being low sellers for all manufacturers, it was decided to steer customers to the smaller Chevette estate. The Ascona Cavalier was also sold in South Africa as the Chevrolet Chevere. It had the Cavalier's droop snout nose, but with grille openings, possibly to help cool the larger engines. Cavalier sales were strong, but a strike at the beginning of 1979 killed output. When the strike ended, Vauxhall returned to full capacity, just at the time when demand for new cars dried up, leaving many cars left unsold. Vauxhall had planned an updated 1980 model to better compete with the Cortina, but they had to wait to shift the old stock before they could launch it. The last hurrah for the Mark I Cavalier, and indeed for the Vauxhall design department, was the Silver Aero shown at the 1980 British Motor Show. With all car design now moving to Opel, Vauxhall wanted to show what it could do. The result was what amounted to a trim kit, bigger 2.4 litre engine, an interior upgrade that Vauxhall said would be offered to existing customers, but it never materialised. But what a trim kit! It dropped the drag down to just 0.32. But producing something that would dampen demand for the upcoming Mark II Cavalier didn't really make much sense, and Vauxhall management seems to have agreed. It showed an insight into what Wayne Cherry and his team could achieve if given more resources. This actually ended up happening as he moved from the design backwaters of Vauxhall to Opel, where he supervised the design of the Astra, the Corsa, the Calibra and even the Tigra, and he eventually became head of GM design back in Detroit. The Ascona Cavalier strategy had proved a well put together pan-European car could work for General Motors. It hadn't threatened the Cortina or even the Marina, come to that, but it had got customers to take another look at Vauxhall, and they liked what they saw. The Mark II Cavalier Mark III Ascona would go a step further. It would be built on the J-body platform that wouldn't just be used for GM's European mid-size car, but also in Australia as the Holden Chimera, in Japan as the Isuzu Aska, and even in North America as the Chevrolet Cavalier and Cadillac Cimarron. It also eventually ended up being used for Korean customers as the 1990 Daewoo Espero. The new platform was little more than a stretched Vauxhall Astra Opel Kadett chassis, but this allowed it to share many parts, such as the front-wheel drive layout, a change from the Mark I Cavalier that had been rear-wheel drive. But Vauxhall would make much of this revised layout as a competitive advantage at launch. It was helpful to both companies as it allowed the Astra and the Cavalier to share the same engines and gearboxes and use virtually identical suspension. This allowed GM to produce a car for less money and allowed them to either get more profit or lower the price to better compete with Ford. With continuing interest in hatchbacks, the car would be a saloon and a 5-door hatchback. The underpinnings of the car were conservative though, basic, solid mechanicals that would just go on working. And this extended to the conservative styling that for the first time was shared across both cars. The front was a compromise between the Cavalier's droop snout and the Ascona's slab design. This improved the Ascona's drag factor from 0.46 down to 0.39. Like the Mark I Cavalier's introduction, they beat Ford's new car to the market by a year. This again offered a fresh new design that stood out against the older competition. And fleet managers and the public were happy that, like the old car, it drove well, it was cheap to service, and it was well put together. As Vauxhall kept telling us in their adverts, it was better by design. In fact, it outclassed all its rivals and was soon flying off dealers' forecourts. Company cars were getting more and more important though, particularly in the UK. Company reps needed a car to travel the length of the country selling their products, so the government gave them a tax break to use their car as their daily driver as well. Soon companies realised that they could offer cars to employees as tax-free perks, whether they drove them for the company or not, and many would include a car as part of their compensation package. So Vauxhall needed to be competitive in the fleet market, which meant that they needed to have a comprehensive lineup. A hatchback Super Mini plus van variants for the people who actually did the work, a class-leading mid-size car for the reps and the telephone sanitisers, and a luxurious large car for the management. The Astra had arrived in 1980, the Nova would arrive in 1982, and the Carlton and Senator rounded out the range. But unlike Vauxhall's 60s and 70s offerings, these cars were all solid, reliable cars that the public wanted. And if the public wanted them, then fleets wanted them. But how would the Cavalier compete against the Cortina's successor? The answer came 1 year after the Cavalier's launch with the new Ford Sierra. To reduce drag, the car had gone for a radical new shape that wasn't to everyone's taste. What Car reviewed both cars, and despite proclaiming the Sierra the better car, they decided that if it was their money, they'd choose the Cavalier, as they just couldn't stomach the Sierra's looks. And when it came down to it, many of the buying public felt the same way. Plus, the Sierra was only a hatchback, where many UK customers still wanted a saloon. By 1984, the Cavalier was the number 2 selling car in the UK, with the Sierra a distant 5th. A combination of Ford's misstep with Vauxhall Opel's increasing ability to make the right moves were finally paying dividends. With all this European success, GM was able to build an estate version of the Cavalier. But it wouldn't be designed in Europe, but in Australia, where it started life as a Holden Chimera wagon. Holden packed up the rear body panels and shipped them back to Europe as knockdown kits, a reversal of the days when Europe sent car parts to Australia for assembly. But on launch, it was a bit of a dud, and sales disappointed. As for engines, like the previous car, there was a range between 1.3 and 2 litres, and a frugal 1.6 litre diesel was also added. But the Cavalier had its fun side as well. The SRI and SRI 130 sporty models produced up to 128 fuel-injected horses. To keep on the pressure, a styling update arrived in 1985, and eventually an open-top version was sold. But you should never write off Ford, and the Sierra was back ahead of the Cavalier again in 1986, thanks to discounts, advertising, and eventually significant styling updates. Vauxhall would keep on the pressure with further changes in 1987 and the limited edition Cavalier Calibra, but in truth they already had their eyes on a new Mark III Cavalier that would arrive the following year. It was clear that people were warming to the Sierra's jelly mold styling, and you couldn't fight against its better drag factor that meant it got better fuel economy. So the new Vauxhall Cavalier, and Opel Vectra as it would be known, would focus on a slippery, updated, fashionable, yet still conservative shape. The chassis would be the new GM 2900 that again got used around the world by cars as diverse as the Saab 9.3 and 9.5, Saturn L Series in America, and thanks to Saab's sale in 2008, the Chinese Sonova D70 in 2013 and Nev's 9.3, which are actually still being produced. But despite the new chassis, most of the mechanicals were pretty similar to the previous car, but as that was selling well, why change it? After all, by government statistics, the Cavalier was the 3rd most common car on the road by the end of the 1980s. The new Cavalier would be launched in 1988 as a 4-door saloon and a 5-door hatchback, but no estate version, especially as it wasn't going to be sold in Australia. While Opel switched to the Vectra name, Vauxhall was worried that this would bring up memories of the rust-prone but similar sounding Vauxhall Victor. Despite sports coupes being out of fashion, Vauxhall bucked the trend with an Opel Manta replacement, the Vauxhall Calibra, also built on a Cavalier chassis. Penned by our old friend Wayne Cherry, now soaring high at Opel's design team, it showed his interest in low drag cars, having a drag factor of just 0.26. The Calibra remained the most aerodynamic mass production car until 1999, when it was usurped by the Honda Insight. But with engines ranging from 2 litres to a 2.5 litre V6 with a 0-60 time of just 7.4 seconds, it was the cool older brother to the workhorse Cavalier and a halo car for the whole range. And it seemed to help, as by 1990 the Cavalier was once again ahead of the Sierra in terms of sales, and it would continue that way until the Mondeo was introduced in 1993. But Ford still ruled the roost, as customers were moving to smaller cars such as the Fiesta and the Escort. While seeing as the chart-topping 1992 Ford Escort was about the same size as the chart-topping 1972 Ford Cortina, maybe most customers didn't need a car with a wheelbase longer than 100 inches. To better compete with the 1985 four-wheel drive Sierra XR 4x4, Vauxhall released the Cavalier 4x4, and like the Calibra, it would get a 2.5 litre V6 engine, giving the Cavalier a lot of power, along with a 2 litre 200 horsepower turbo model. Safety features that were appearing on other cars also showed up, such as ABS and airbags. The exterior got an update to keep the car looking fresh ahead of the next version of the Cavalier, renamed the Vectra, that arrived in 1995. In the space of 20 years, Vauxhall, with Opel's help, had gone from a loss-making enterprise that GM was thinking of closing down into the number 2 UK car maker. Bob Price's daring plan to release a car in just 6 months and having to get militant 1970s unions on their side in the process was a masterstroke that saved many Vauxhall manufacturing jobs. But to continue to survive, it had to give up on designing its own cars and just focus on manufacturing and sales. It did both of those things brilliantly. There's a good reason why Vauxhall sold over 1.8 million Cavaliers. It wasn't the highest quality car on the market, it wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the coolest, but in the areas that counted, servicing, price, durability, and yes, even looks, it gave an all-round package that couldn't be beaten. A big thank you to all of my patrons for supporting me. To get early advert-free access to new videos or to appear in the credits, please consider supporting me using the Patreon link below from just $1 or 80p a month, and hit that subscribe button to get notified of new videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.